Sir, my question has two dimensions. Basically, I'll be asking on language. So, just I want to give a very brief background of my question. So, language represent a structure of power. A structure.
Not to stop you. अगर आप चाहें तो आप हिंदी में बात कर सकते हैं. It's up to you. Entirely up to you.
ठीक है सर.
What is the point of constantly talking of decoloniality otherwise? Go ahead.
Yes sir. सर लैंग्वेज मतलब एक पावर स्ट्रक्चर को रिप्रेजेंट कर सकता है या फिर पावर स्ट्रक्चर बना सकते हैं. और दूसरा बात ये है कि लैंग्वेज ऑफ ए गिवन कल्चर enormously I mean shape how a people think of things like their perception on family, on society, on state or other things. So coming to your point, like manufacture foreign of Bharat, we have talked like the minority majority debate represent the new avatar of two nation theory. But I would say we have multiple nation theory based on language based assertion, like we have in Northeast, we have in South or other part of the country. So how to address this like language based fault line in spite of having an underlying unity of all Indian languages? Second question is, sir, when we talk about decolonization, sir, particularly in judicial space, like the official, the prevalent language is English. When we say like decolonization in judicial space, how we can assert that without representation of Indian languages, we can ensure decolonization in judicial space?
Fair. So, on the basis of the limited reading that I've done so far, I blame two specific milestones in Bharatiya history for entrenching language-based chauvinism and regionalism. The partition of Bengal had both a religious component as well as a linguistic component of 1905. That needs to be understood in greater detail. And how that particular language-based division gradually translated to several provinces in British territories being carved out on the basis of language, then finally culminating in independent Bharat taking the very same policy forward in the form of the States Reorganization Act of 1956, where you started creating state-based languages. Okay? Or language-based states rather. There was, I think, one suggestion that was given by Rajagopalachari then, which is that you might as well divide the country into 8 or 9 administrative units, with each of them having at least more than one language as their official language, thereby ensuring that there is greater language representation at the state level. What is everybody looking for? Let's be clear about it. What are we saying? It's one thing for us to use a particular language in the course of our societal interactions, but it does not get the same sense of respect or mainstreaming until it becomes the state language for the purposes of state communication, right? And therefore, at the very least, assuming that language-based states are an existing reality and they are the reality for the foreseeable future, why don't we think of more than one official language for each state at the very least? Wherein you have one perhaps dominant language, and maybe the second language alternates every few years, depending on the number of minorities in that particular state. And the question will be, how economically feasible is this? What does it translate to in the form of burden on the state when it comes to doing this? If you think of yourself as a civilizational state, this is a must no matter what the cost. But if you want to nationalize a civilization, you will succeed in reducing economic burden, but you will increase your societal fissures. And every few years you will have this issue coming up in the form of legitimate representation for visibility at the state level. That's one of the reasons that I think it makes a lot more sense to see Bharat as a smaller version of Europe in terms of languages. The difference being that there is greater civilizational and dharmic unity within Bharat, but that linguistic diversity needs to be respected at a greater level. Unless and until you do that, to answer the question of the previous gentleman who asked the question of aren't we giving more handles to the other, I am saying you're handing more weapons to the other side which is interested in using these identities to create further fissures. So wherever it's possible, not to appease, but to legitimately address a certain concern, do it. You ask a few people coming from the Northeast, they'll clearly say, I'm sorry, Bengali is not our script. What is happening to our scripts? How is that a wrong question to ask? If you don't do that, mischievous elements are bound to be given weapons from outside the country, and legitimate sentiments will become secessionist sentiments. Stop it from happening as soon as possible. So I would say Bharat needs to become more linguistically diverse in terms of its business transactions, in terms of its state transactions, how much ever is possible. So, okay, let's look at it this way. If the union were to issue a particular document which perhaps is meant for a particular state, at the very least follow the three-language policy in giving that particular document. English for wider consumption, unfortunately, Hindi for whatever reason, and at the very least that state's language. Will that not shut up the Dravidianists? They obviously have only these kind of issues to constantly cry and whine about. Take it away from them. As someone who comes from the glorious land of Tamil Nadu, I think Dravidianism is a cancer. And it single-handedly has created an artificial divide with a lot of support from external actors. It needs to be addressed. It can be addressed provided nobody else is interested in imposing their language shamanism on others. I have no hatred of any Bharatiya language. Underline Bharatiya. That's the operative word. Which means nobody can at least accuse me of having a particular hatred or ghana for Hindi. I switch to Hindi as quickly as possible whenever I speak in public, and as often as possible. So I can't be accused of someone who has a problem with the language. If you're interested in keeping the union together, particularly given the history of several mischievous non-state external actors, you have to build bridges which are two-way streets, not a one-way street. Second, what can be done before the judiciary? $1 million question. As someone who's a stakeholder in that particular system, I will do my best to steer clear of the Contempt of Courts Act and make my submissions in as diplomatic a fashion as possible, going against the grain of my own nature. Okay. पहले हिंदी को तो सुप्रीम कोर्ट में जगह मिले, उसके बाद बाकियों का देखेंगे. You guys are not able to impose yourself for the Supreme Court. Where do we stand? So, I think an interesting suggestion came from one person who makes it a point to speak of indigenization of our content and education. Namely that when the International Court of Justice or European judicial systems can at the very least operate with multiple languages, why can't a country that constantly boasts of its linguistic diversity do the very same thing when it comes to its judiciary? Surely you don't expect a judge of the Supreme Court to know more than one language. I'm asking myself, why doesn't it occur to us to create a system of interpreters, which is possible in United Nations, which is possible in the European Parliament, which is possible in the European Court of Justice? Why can't it be possible in this country, which is a subcontinent that masquerades as a country? It's surprising that you choose to highlight your diversity when you have to speak the greatness of your country, but when it comes to the application of that particular concept on a very real level, somehow the diversity seems to take a backseat. Imagine the number of mischievous arguments you can take away from a lot of anti-nationals. Oh, I've dropped the word. What to do? Go ahead. Next.